I'm doing okay, but we'll see. Hey, Joe. Yeah.
The Senate will convene as a court of impeachment, and the chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. All-powerful God, sovereign of this beloved land, you are our fortress, and you desire justice to be done. As our Senate jurors remember their accountability to you, use them to cause justice to roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Lord, during this impeachment trial, give our lawmakers the gift of discernment so that they will know truth from falsehood. Inspire them to commit their thoughts and decisions to you. Let your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is done in heaven. We pray in your mighty name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the And Senators, will you please be seated? And if there's no objection, I hear none, the journal proceedings of the trial are approved to date. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silence on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting for the trial of the article of impeachment against Donald John Trump, former President of the United States.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, for the information of all senators, no motions were filed this morning, so we'll proceed to the House Manager's presentation. We anticipate 2 10-minute breaks and a 45-minute dinner break around 6 p.m.
In pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 47, the managers for the House of Representatives have 16 hours to make the presentation of the case. The Senate will now hear you, and I recognize Mr. Manager Raskin to begin the presentation of the case for the House of Representatives. Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, members of the Senate. Good morning, good day. Some people think this trial is a contest of lawyers, or even worse, a competition between political parties. It's neither. It's a moment of truth for America. My late father, Marcus Raskin, once wrote, "Democracy needs a ground to stand upon, and that ground is the truth." America needs the truth about ex-President Trump's role in inciting the insurrection on January 6th because it threatened our government and it disrupted, it easily could have destroyed the peaceful transfer of power in the United States for the first time in 233 years. It was suggested yesterday by President Trump's counsel that this is really like a a very bad accident or a natural disaster where lots of people get injured or killed, and society is just out looking for someone to blame. And that's a natural and normal human reaction, according to the President's counsel, but he says it's totally unfair in this case. President Trump, according to Mr. Castor, is essentially an innocent bystander who got swept up in this catastrophe but did nothing wrong. In this assertion, Mr. Castor unerringly echoes his client, ex-President Trump, who declared after the insurrection that his conduct in the affair was totally appropriate. And therefore, we can only assume he could do and would do the exact same thing again, because he said his conduct was totally appropriate. So now the factual inquiry of the trial is squarely posed for us. The jurisdictional constitutional issue is gone. Whether you were persuaded by the President's constitutional analysis yesterday or not, the Senate voted to reject it. And so the Senate is now properly exercising its jurisdiction and sitting as a court of impeachment, conducting a trial on the facts. We are having a trial on the facts. The House says ex-President Donald Trump incited a violent insurrection against Congress and the Constitution and the people. The President's lawyers and the President say his conduct was totally appropriate, and he's essentially an innocent victim of circumstances, like the other innocent victims that we'll see getting caught up in all of the violence and chaos over the next several days. The evidence will be for you to see and hear and digest. The evidence will show you that ex-President Trump was no innocent bystander. The evidence will show that he clearly incited the January 6th insurrection. It will show that Donald Trump surrendered his role as commander-in-chief and became the inciter-in-chief of a dangerous insurrection. And this was, as one of our colleagues put it so cogently on January 6th itself, the greatest betrayal of the presidential oath in the history of the United States. The evidence will show you that he saw it coming and was not remotely surprised by the violence. And when the violence inexorably and inevitably came as predicted and overran this body and the House of Representatives with chaos, we will show you that he completely abdicated his duty as commander-in-chief to stop the violence and protect the government and protect our officers and protect our people. He violated his oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, the government, and the people of the United States. The evidence will show you that he assembled, inflamed, and incited his followers to descend upon the Capitol to stop the steal, to block Vice President Pence and Congress from finalizing his opponent's election victory over him. It will show that he had been warned that these followers were prepared for a violent attack, targeting us at the Capitol through media reports, law enforcement reports, and even arrests. In short, we will prove that the impeached president was no innocent bystander, whose conduct was totally appropriate and should be a standard for future presidents, but that he incited this attack and he saw it coming. To us, it may have felt like chaos and madness, but there was method in the madness that day. This was an organized attack on the counting of the Electoral College votes in joint session of the United States Congress under the 12th Amendment and under the Electoral Count Act to prevent Vice President Mike Pence and to prevent us from counting sufficient Electoral College votes to certify Joe Biden's victory of 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, a margin that President Trump had declared a landslide in 2016. When my colleague, Mr. Neguse, speaks after me, he will set forth in detail the exact roadmap of all the evidence in the case. My fellow House managers and I will then take you through that evidence step by step so everyone can see exactly how these events unfolded. But I want to tell you a few key reasons right now that we know this case is not about blaming an innocent bystander for the horrific violence and harm that took place on January 6th. This is about holding accountable the person singularly responsible for inciting the attack. Let's start with December 12th. You will see during this trial a man who praised and encouraged and cultivated violence. We have just begun to fight, he says, more than a month after the election has taken place. And that's before the 2nd Million MAGA March, a rally that ended in serious violence and even the burning of a church. And as the president forecast, it was only the beginning. On December 19th, 18 days before January 6th, he told his base about where the battle would be that they would fight next. January 6th would be wild, he promised. Be there, will be wild, said the President of the United States of America. And that, too, turned out to be true. You'll see in the days that followed, Donald Trump continued to aggressively promote January 6th to his followers. The event was scheduled at the precise time that Congress would be meeting in joint session to count the Electoral College votes and to finalize the 2020 presidential election. In fact, in the days leading up to the attack, you'll learn that there were countless social media posts, news stories, and most importantly, credible reports from the FBI and Capitol Police that the thousands gathering for the President's Save America March were violent, organized with weapons, and were targeting the Capitol. This mob got organized so openly because, as they would later scream in these halls, and as they posted on forums before the attack, they were sent here by the President. They were invited here by the President of the United States of America. And when they showed up, knowing of these reports that the crowd was angry and it was armed, here's what Donald Trump told them. President Trump whipped the crowd into a frenzy, exhorting followers, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. And then he aimed straight at the Capitol, declaring, you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. He told them to fight like hell, and they brought us hell on that day. Incited by President Trump, his mob attacked the Capitol. This assault unfolded live on television before a horrified nation. According to those around him at the time, this is how President Trump reportedly responded to the attack that we saw him incite in public. Delight, enthusiasm, confusion as to why others around him weren't as happy as he was. Trump incited the January 6th attack, and when his mob overran and occupied the Senate and attacked the House and assaulted law enforcement, he watched it on TV like a reality show. He reveled in it. And he did nothing to help us as commander-in-chief. Instead, he served as the inciter-in-chief, sending tweets that only further incited the rampaging mob. He made statements lauding and sympathizing with the insurrectionists. Over at 4:17 p.m., over 3 hours after the beginning of the siege, for the very first time he spoke out loud, not on Twitter, spoke out loud to the American people. Here's what he said.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt.
So you might be saying, all right, the president is going to console us now. He's going to reassure America. He knows our pain. He knows we're hurt. We've just seen these horrific images of officers being impaled and smashed over the head. We've just been under attack for 3 hours. But here's what he actually goes on to say.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side.
So you think he's about to decry the mayhem and violence, the unprecedented spectacle of this mob attack on the U.S. Capitol, but he's still promoting the big lie that was responsible for inflaming and inciting the mob in the first place. If anyone ever had a doubt as to his focus that day, it was not to defend us, it was not to console us, it was to praise and sympathize and commiserate with the rampaging mob. It was to continue to act as inciter-in-chief, not commander-in-chief, by telling the mob that their election had been stolen from them. Even then, after that vicious attack, he continued to spread the big lie. And as everyone here knows, Joe Biden won by more than 7 million votes and 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. But Donald Trump refused to accept his loss even after this attack. And he celebrated the people who violently interfered with the peaceful transfer of power for the first time in American history, and did that at his urging. And when he did, in this video, finally tell them to go home in peace, he added this message: "We love you. You're very special." Distinguished members of the Senate, this is a day that will live in disgrace in American history. That is, unless you ask Donald Trump, because this is what he tweeted before he went to bed that night at 6:01 p.m. Not consoling the nation, not reassuring everyone that the government was secure, not a single word that entire day condemning the violent insurrection. That's what he says. "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots. In other words, this was all perfectly natural and foreseeable to Donald Trump. At the beginning of the day, he told you it was coming. At the end of the day, he basically says, "I told you this would happen." And then he adds, "Remember this day forever." But not as a day of disgrace, a day of horror and trauma, as the rest of us remember it, but as a day of celebration, a day of commemoration. And if we let it be, it will be a day of continuation, a call to action, and a rallying cry for the next rounds of insurrectionary justice, because all of this was totally appropriate. Senators, the stakes of this trial could not be more serious. Every American, young and old and in between, is invited to participate with us in this essential journey to find the facts and share the truth. Trials are public events in a democracy, and no trial is more public or significant than an impeachment trial. Because the insurrection brought shocking violence, bloodshed, and pain in the nation's capital, and we will be showing relevant clips of the mob's attack on police officers and other innocent people, we do urge parents and teachers to exercise close review of what young people are watching here, and please watch along with them if you're allowing them to watch. The impeachment managers will try to give warnings before the most graphic and disturbing violence that took place is shown. We believe that the manager's comprehensive and meticulous presentation will lead to one powerful and irresistible conclusion: Donald Trump committed a massive crime against our Constitution and our people, and the worst violation of the presidential oath of office in the history of the United States of America. For this, he was impeached by the House of Representatives, and he must be convicted by the United States Senate. Before I close, I want to address a constitutional issue still lingering from yesterday's argument. The president obviously is still exploring ways to change the subject and talk about anything other than his responsibility for inciting the attack. We heard a lot yesterday about his claim that this incitement of the insurrection was perfectly appropriate because it's somehow protected by the First Amendment. And this little diversion caught my eye because I've been a professor of constitutional law and the First Amendment for decades. And as we'll demonstrate over the course of the trial, the factual premise and the legal underpinnings of that claim are all wrong. They present President Trump as merely like a guy at a rally expressing a political opinion that we disagree with, and now we're trying to put him in jail for it. That has nothing to do with the reality of these charges or his constitutional offense. The particular political opinions being expressed are not why we impeached the president and have nothing to do with it. It makes no difference what the ideological content of the mob was. And if we license and forgive incitement to violent insurrection by militant Trump followers this week, you can be sure there will be a whole bunch of new ideological flavors coming soon. As we'll demonstrate with overwhelming evidence, portraying Trump as a guy on the street being punished for his ideas is a false description of his actions, his intent, and the role that he played on January 6th when he willfully incited an insurrectionary mob to riot at the Capitol. Last week, 144 constitutional scholars, including Floyd Abrams, a ferocious defender of free speech, Charles Fried, President Reagan's Solicitor General, Stephen Calabrese, the co-founder of the Federalist Society, released a statement calling the president's First Amendment arguments legally frivolous, adding, "We all agree that the First Amendment does not prevent the Senate from convicting President Trump and disqualifying him from holding future office." They went on to say, "No reasonable scholar or jurist could conclude that President Trump had a First Amendment right to incite a violent attack on the seat of the legislative branch, or then to sit back and watch on television as Congress was terrorized and the Capitol sacked." Incitement to violence is, of course, not protected by the First Amendment. That's why most Americans have dismissed Donald Trump's First Amendment rhetoric simply by referring to Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's handy phrase, "You can't shout fire in a crowded theater." But even that time-honored principle doesn't begin to capture how off-base the argument is. This case is much worse than someone who falsely shouts fire in a crowded theater. It's more like a case where the town fire chief, who's paid to put out fires, sends a mob not to yell fire in a crowded theater, but to actually set the theater on fire. And who then, when the fire alarms go off and the calls start flooding into the fire department, asking for help, does nothing but sit back, encourage the mob to continue its rampage, and watch the fire spread on TV with glee and delight. So then we say this fire chief should never be allowed to hold this public job again, and you're fired and you're permanently disqualified, and he objects. And he says, we're violating his free speech rights just because he's pro-mob or pro-fire or whatever it might be. Come on. I mean, you really don't need to go to law school to figure out what's wrong with that argument. Here's the key. Undoubtedly, a private person can run around on the street expressing his or her support for the enemies of the United States and advocating the overthrow of the United States government. You've got a right to do that under the First Amendment. But if the president spent all of his days doing that, uttering the exact same words, expressing support for the enemies of the United States and for overthrowing the government, is there anyone here who doubts that this would be a violation of his oath of office to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that he or she could be impeached for doing that? Look, if you're president of the United States, you've chosen a side with your oath of office, and if you break it, we can impeach, convict, remove, and disqualify you permanently from holding any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. As Justice Scalia once said, memorably, you can't ride with the cops and root for the robbers. And if you become inciter-in-chief to the insurrection, you can't expect to be on the payroll as commander-in-chief for the Union. Trump was the president of the United States, and he'd sworn to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He had an affirmative, binding duty, one that set him apart from everyone else in the country, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, including all the laws against assaulting federal officers, destroying federal property, violently threatening members of Congress, and the Vice President interfering with federal elections and dozens of other federal laws that are well known to all of you. When he incited insurrection on January 6th, he broke that oath. He violated that duty. And that's why we're here today. And that's why he has no credible constitutional defense. I'll tell you a final sad story in this kaleidoscope of sadness and terror and violence. One of our Capitol officers who defended us that day was a longtime veteran of our force, a brave and honorable public servant who spent several hours battling the mob as part of one of those blue lines defending the Capitol in our democracy. For several hours straight, as the marauders punched and kicked and mauled and spit upon and hit officers with baseball bats and fire extinguishers, cursed the cops, and stormed our Capitol, he defended us, and he lived every minute of his oath of office. And afterwards, overwhelmed by emotion, he broke down in the rotunda. And he cried for 15 minutes. And he shouted out, "I got called an N-word 15 times today." And then he recorded, "I sat down with one of my buddies, another black guy, and tears just started streaming down my face. And I said, 'What the F, man? Is this America?'" That's the question before all of you in this trial. Is this America? Can our country and our democracy ever be the same if we don't hold accountable the person responsible for inciting the violent attack against our country, our capital, and our democracy, and all of those who serve us so faithfully and honorably? Is this America? Mr. Neguse will now provide a roadmap of our evidentiary case.
Mr. President, distinguished senators, counsel, like several of you, I am a child of immigrants. And as a son of immigrants, I believe firmly in my heart that the United States is the greatest republic that this world has ever known. A hallmark of our republic since the days of George Washington has been the peaceful transfer of power. For centuries, we've accepted it as fact. Unfortunately, sadly, we know now that we can no longer take that for granted. Because as lead manager Raskin explained on January 6th, the peaceful transition of power was violently interrupted when a mob stormed this Capitol and desecrated this chamber. As you'll see during the course of this trial, that mob was summoned, assembled, and incited by the former President of the United States, Donald Trump. And he did that because he wanted to stop the transfer of power so that he could retain power, even though he had lost the election. And when the violence erupted, when they were here in our building with weapons, he did nothing to stop it. If we are to protect our republic and prevent something like this from ever happening again, he must be convicted. Now, I want to be very clear about what we will show you during the course of this trial. As my fellow managers present our case to you today, tonight, tomorrow, it'll be helpful to think about President Trump's incitement of insurrection in three distinct parts: the attack, the provocation, the attack, and the harm. Let's start with the provocation. We will show during the course of this trial that this attack was provoked by the president, incited by the president. And as a result, it was predictable and it was foreseeable. And of course, that makes sense. And this mob was well orchestrated. Their conduct was intentional. They did it all in plain sight, proudly, openly, and loudly. Because they believed, they truly believed that they were doing this for him, that this was their patriotic duty. They even predicted that he would protect them. And for the most part, they were right. In his unique role as commander-in-chief of our country, and as the one person that the mob was listening to and following orders from, he had the power to stop it. And he didn't. Now, some have said that President Trump's remarks, his speech on January 6th, was just a speech. Well, let me ask you this. When in our history has a speech led thousands of people to storm our nation's capital with weapons, to scale the walls, break windows, kill a Capitol police officer? This was not just a speech. It didn't just happen. And as you evaluate the facts that we present to you, it will become clear exactly where that mob came from. Because here's the thing, President Trump's words, as you'll see on January 6th, in that speech, just like the mob's actions, were carefully chosen. Those words had a very specific meaning to that crowd. And how do we know this? Because in the weeks prior to, during, and after the election, he used the same words over and over and over again. You will hear over and over three things. You can see them on the screens. First, what lead manager Raskin referred to as the big lie, that the election was stolen, full of fraud, rigged. You will hear over and over him using that lie to urge his supporters to never concede and stop the steal. And finally, you will hear the call to arms, that it was his supporters' patriotic duty to fight like hell. To do what? To stop the steal, to stop the election from being stolen by showing up in this very chamber, to stop you, to stop us. I'd respectfully ask that you remember those three phrases as you consider the evidence today. Election was stolen, stop the steal, and fight like hell, because they did not just appear on January 6th. Let me show you what I mean. Let's start with the big lie. You will see during this trial that the president realized really by last spring that he could lose. He might lose the election. So what did he do? He started planting the seeds to get some of his supporters ready by saying that he could only lose the election if it was stolen. I mean, in other words, really what he did is create a no-lose scenario. Either he won the election, or he would have some angry supporters, not all, but some, who believed that if he lost, the election had to be rigged. And they would be angry. Because He was telling Americans that their vote had been stolen. And in America, our vote is our voice. So his false claims about election fraud, that was the drumbeat being used to inspire, instigate, and ignite them, to anger them. Watch this clip.
Because we're not going to let this election be taken away from us. That's the only way they're going to win it. We're not going to let it happen. It's the only way we can lose, in my opinion, is massive fraud.
We all know what happened after that. He lost. He lost the election. But remember, he had that no-lose scenario that I referenced earlier. He told his base that the election was stolen, as he had forecasted. And then he told them, your election has been stolen, but you cannot concede. You must stop the steal.
You can't let another person steal that election from you. All over the country, people are together in holding up signs, stop the steal. The Democrats are trying to steal the White House. You cannot let them. You just can't let them.
Now, while he's inciting his supporters, he's also simultaneously doing everything he possibly can to overturn the election. First, he begins with the courts, a legitimate avenue to challenge the election. But he ignores all of their adverse rulings when all of his claims are thrown out. Then he moves on to trying to pressure state election officials to block the election results for his opponent, even though he'd lost in their states. You'll hear my fellow managers discuss that in detail. Then he tries to threaten state election officials to actually change the votes, to make him the winner, even threatening criminal penalties if they refused. He had the Justice Department investigate his claims, and even they found no support for those claims. So he tried to persuade some members of his party in Congress to block the certification of his vote with attacks in public forums. When that failed, he tried to intimidate the Vice President of the United States of America to refuse to certify the vote and send it back to the states. None of it worked. So, what does he do? With his back against the wall, when all else has failed, he turns back to his supporters who he'd already spent months telling them that the election was stolen. And he amplified it further. He turned it up a notch. He told them that they had to be ready not just to stop the steal, but to fight like hell.
We're in a fight for the survival of our nation, and we are going to keep on fighting. We will never surrender. We will only win. Now is not the time to retreat. Now is the time to fight harder than ever before. We have to go all the way, and we're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now. We will not bend. We will not break. We will not yield. We will never give in. We will never give up. We will never back down. We will never, ever surrender.
You will see that in the months as the president made these statements, people listened. Armed supporters surrounded election officials' homes. The Secretary of State for Georgia got death threats. Officials warned the president that his rhetoric was dangerous and it was going to result in deadly violence. And that's what makes this so different, because when he saw firsthand the violence that his conduct was creating, he didn't stop it. He didn't condemn the violence. He incited it further. And he got more specific. He didn't just tell them to fight like hell. He told them how, where, and when. He made sure they had advance notice, 18 days advance notice. He sent his save the date for January 6th. He told them to march to the Capitol and fight like hell. On January 6th, as Lead Manager Raskin said, the exact same day that we were certifying the election results. And what time was that rally scheduled for? The exact same time that this chamber was certifying the election results in joint session. When did he conclude his speech? Literally moments before Speaker Pelosi had gavelled us into session. Many of us were in the House during that joint session of Congress. I was sitting 2 rows behind Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell. I remember it vividly. And as we were standing there, fulfilling our solemn oath to the Constitution, the President was finishing his speech just a couple of miles away. How did he conclude that infamous speech? With a final call to action. He told them to march down Pennsylvania Avenue, to come here, that it was their patriotic duty because the election had been stolen. And when they heard his speech, they understood his words and what they meant because they had heard it before. Let's take just a minute and really look at his words on January 6th as he spoke at the Save America rally. Now, remember, I told you, you'd hear 3 phrases: the election was stolen, stop the steal, and fight like hell. Let's start with that first phrase.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen. There's never been anything like this. It's a pure theft in American history. Everybody knows it. Make no mistake, this election was stolen from you, from me, and from the country.
Now, of course, each of you heard those words before. So had the crowd. The president had spent months telling his supporters that the election had been stolen, and he used this speech to incite them further, to inflame them, to stop the steal, to stop the certification of the election results.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal. We must stop the steal.
Finally, the president used this speech as a call to arms. It was not rhetorical. Some of his supporters had been primed for this over many months. As you'll learn, days before this speech, as lead manager Raskin noted, there were vast reports across all major media outlets that thousands of people would be armed, that they'd be violent. You'll learn that Capitol Police and the FBI reported in the days leading up to the attack that thousands in the crowd would be targeting the Capitol specifically, that they had arrested people with guns the night before the attack on weapons charges. And this is what our commander-in-chief said to the crowd in the face of those warnings right before they came here.
We will not let them silence your voices. We're not going to let it happen. Not going to let it happen. Thank you. And you have to get your people to fight, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them. Senators, this clearly was not just one speech. It didn't just happen. It was part of a carefully planned, months-long effort with a very specific instruction. Show up on January 6th and get your people to fight the certification. He incited it. It was foreseeable. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. The president's former chief of staff, is a retired Marine, 4-star general, was confirmed by this body to be the Secretary of Homeland Security, overwhelming vote. That man was John Kelly. And on the day after the insurrection, he said this.
You know, the president knows who he's talking to when he tweets or when he makes statements. He knows who he's talking to, and he knows what he wants them to do. And the fact that he said the things he's been saying, the things he's been saying since the election, and encouraging people, no surprise again at what happened yesterday.
No surprise. Think about that. No surprise. The president had every reason to know that this would happen because he assembled the mob, he summoned the mob, and he incited the mob. He knew when he took that podium on that fateful morning that those in attendance had heeded his words and they were waiting for his orders to begin fighting. And that, of course, brings me, my fellow managers, to what happened here in this building. As lead manager Raskin stated, my colleagues are going to walk through the events of January 6th and the evidence in very great detail. They are painful to watch and to recount, and I'm not going to repeat the evidence now. But I do want to be clear about what also happened during that terrible attack, and that is this, that President Trump once again failed us. Because when the violence erupted, when we and the law enforcement officials protecting us, protecting you, were under attack, as each of you were being evacuated from this chamber, from a violent mob, as we were being evacuated from the House, he could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence. It was his duty as commander-in-chief to stop the violence, and he alone had that power. Not just because of his unique role as commander-in-chief, but because they believed that they were following his orders. They said so.
I thought I was following my president. I thought I was following what we were called to do.
President Trump requested that we be in D.C. on the 6th.
You heard it from them. They were doing what he wanted them to do. They wouldn't have listened to you, to me, to the Vice President of the United States, who they were attacking. They didn't stop in the face of law enforcement, police officers fighting for their lives to stop them. They were following the president. He alone, our commander-in-chief, had the power to stop it. And he didn't. You will hear evidence tonight, tomorrow, throughout the trial, about his refusal as commander-in-chief to respond to numerous desperate pleas on the phone, across social media, begging him to stop the attack. And you will see his relentless attack on Vice President Pence, who was at that very moment hiding with his family as armed extremists were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," calling him a traitor. You will see that even when he did, finally, 3.5 hours into the attack, tell these people to go home in peace, he added, as lead manager Raskin said, I'll quote, "You're very special. We love you." Think for a moment, just a moment, of the lives lost that day, of the more than 140 wounded police officers, and ask yourself if as soon as this had started, President Trump had simply gone onto TV, just logged onto Twitter and said, "Stop the attack." If he had done so with even half as much force as he said, "Stop the steal," how many lives would we have saved? Sadly, he didn't do that. At the end of the day, the president was not successful in stopping the certification. That we know, thanks to the bravery of our law enforcement and to the bravery of the senators in this room. Each of you who still fulfilled your constitutional duty, even under the threat of mortal peril. But there can be no doubt of the grave harm that he caused. To our elected leaders, to us, our families, to all who work in the Capitol, our staff, your staff, to our brave Capitol Police who defend us tirelessly with little thanks, who believed that they had a commander-in-chief who would defend and protect them and instead put them in harm's way, to those killed for heeding his command, to our democracy and the system which ensures that we have a president elected by the people, to our national security and our standing in the world. The harm was real. The damage was real. 5 people lost their lives on that terrible, tragic day. A woman was shot dead 50 feet from where we later certified the election results. And for those who question just how bad it was, criminal complaints recently unsealed by the Department of Justice are more than revealing. You'll see one of these documents on the screen. In the charging affidavit of one of the leaders of the Proud Boys, we learned that members of this group said, I'm going to quote, "They would have killed Mike Pence if given the chance." In another, we learned of a tweet in real time while they were in the building stating, "We broke into the Capitol. We got inside. We did our part. We were looking for Nancy Pelosi to shoot her in the frickin' brain, but we didn't find her." And for anyone who suggests otherwise, these defendants themselves have told you exactly why they were here. You'll see this in the trial. That in the halls of the Capitol, on social media, in news interviews, and in charging documents, they confirm they were following the president's orders. You can see some of the statements on that screen. One who said, "Trump wants all able-bodied patriots." Another, that President Trump is calling us to fight. This isn't a joke. Another one, "I thought I was following my president. I thought I was following what we were called to do. Our president wants us here. We wait and take orders from the president." He made them believe over many weeks that the election was stolen and they were following his command to take back their country. As I prepared for today, yesterday, this trial, There's one memory that I couldn't shake, which was on the night of January 6th, and the feeling of walking back onto the House floor and seeing many of you there. I remember us finishing our task at 4 in the morning. And as I walked off the floor, I was so grateful for the opportunity to thank the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, for his actions, for standing before us and asking us to follow our oath and our faith and our duty. We only got a couple of hours of sleep that morning. Early the next day, I called my dad, who came to this country, as I mentioned, as an immigrant 40 years ago. And I told him that the proudest moment by far of serving in Congress for me was going back onto the floor with each of you to finish the work that we had started. I'm humbled to be back with you today. And just as on January 6th, when we overcame that attack on our capital, on our country, I'm hopeful that at this trial, we can use our resolve and our resilience to again uphold our democracy by faithfully applying the law, vindicating the Constitution, and holding President Trump accountable for his actions.
Senators, Representatives Joaquin Castro and Eric Swalwell will now show the evidence of President Trump's long campaign to delegitimize his electoral defeat and to galvanize his supporters to help him retain his power at any cost. So we're going to go at this point step by step and explain the progression all the way up until the attack.
Good afternoon, y'all. My name is Joaquin Castro, and I represent San Antonio in the United States Congress. There's a saying that a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put on its shoes. And that was before the internet. The point of that saying is that a lie can do incredible damage and destruction. And that's especially true when that lie is told by the most powerful person on earth, our Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. This attack did not come from one speech, and it didn't happen by accident. The evidence shows clearly that this mob was provoked over many months by Donald J. Trump. And if you look at the evidence, his purposeful conduct, you'll see that the attack was foreseeable and preventable. I'll start by discussing President Trump's actions leading up to the election, when he set up his big lie. Beginning in the spring of 2020, President Trump began to fall behind in the polls. And by July, President Trump had reached a new low. He was running 15 points behind his opponent. And he was scared. He began to believe that he could legitimately lose the election. And so he did something entirely unprecedented in the history of our nation. He refused to commit to a peaceful transition of power. Here's what he said.
Can you give a direct answer? You will accept the election?
I have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no.
Do you
commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transfer of power.
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
Senators, the President of the United States said, quote, "There won't be a transition of power. There'll be a continuation." President Trump was given every opportunity to tell his supporters, yes, if I lose, I will peacefully transfer power to the next president. Instead, he told his supporters the only way he could lose the election is if it was stolen. In tweet after tweet, he made sweeping allegations about election fraud that couldn't possibly be true. But that was the point. He didn't care if the claims were true. He wanted to make sure that his supporters were angry, like the election was being ripped away from them. On May 24th, 6 months before the election, he tweeted, "It will be the greatest rigged election in history." How could he possibly know it would be the greatest rigged election in history 6 months before the election happened? And on June 22nd, more of the same. Rigged 2020 election. It will be the scandal of our times. Again, about an election that had not even happened. On July 30th, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. Again, just big words with nothing to prove them. But he wanted to make his supporters believe that an election victory would be stolen from him and from them. And this was to rile up his base, to make them angry. Now, these were just a few of the many times President Trump tweeted about this. And he did it in speeches, in rallies, and in television, too.
This is going to be the greatest election disaster in history. Because the only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election. That's right. It's a rigged election. It's the only way we're going to lose.
But this will be one of the greatest fraudulent, most fraudulent elections ever.
This is clearly a man who refuses to accept the possibility or the reality in our democracy of losing an election. And there are dozens more tweets and speeches of Donald Trump spreading his lie, but you get the point. His supporters got the point as well. They firmly believe that if he lost, it was because the election was rigged.
Will you accept the result if Joe Biden wins?
No.
Under any circumstance?
No.
Why is that?
Because it's lies and deceit and corruption.
Do you think that if we get to election night or in the following days, if Biden winds up somehow becoming the winner, do you think it's rigged?
Oh, yes. Very much so.
Election night,
yes.
Days after, if it shows up that Joe Biden won,
yes.
In your opinion, would that be the only way that Trump could lose, that it'd be a rigged election? Is that the only way Joe Biden can win?
Absolutely. I agree with that, because there's no way in heck our president's going to lose. But yes, it would be a rigged election. There's some type of cheating went on, what have you. And I firmly believe that.
Now, all of us in this room have run for election, and it's no fun to lose. I'm a Texas Democrat. We've lost a few elections over the years. But can you imagine telling your supporters that the only way you could possibly lose is if an American election was rigged and stolen from you? And ask yourself whether you've ever seen anyone at any level of government make the same claim about their own election. But that's exactly what President Trump did. He truly made his base believe that the only way he could lose was if the election was rigged. And senators, all of us know and all of us understand how dangerous that is for our country. because the most combustible thing you can do in a democracy is convince people that an election doesn't count, that their voice and their vote don't count, and that it's all been stolen, especially if what you're saying are lies. Let us turn now to the election. As you know, the results were not fully reported on election night, which is not unusual in our nation's history. But by November 7th, major news networks, including Fox News, reported that once the remaining votes were counted, Joe Biden would be the likely victor. So President Trump began urging his supporters to stop the count. I would imagine that if we went around this room, there are folks sitting here that started down on election night and ended up coming back up and winning their races. Perhaps that's why some of you are seated in this room today. But imagine if you were behind and the results start coming in, and as you started pulling ahead, your opponent said, "That's not fair. Stop the count while I'm still ahead." That's what Donald Trump did. But that's not how America works. Here, every vote counts. You don't just stop counting when one person is ahead. We count every vote. And let's be clear. President Trump knew that you can't just stop counting votes, but he wanted to inflame his base. There was a purpose behind this, to truly make them believe that counting votes would result in a stolen, rigged election. He said at 12:49 a.m. on election night, quote, "They're trying to steal the election. We will never let them do it." A little over an hour later, at roughly 2:30 in the morning, before all the votes were even close to being counted, he goes even further and actually declares victory. Take a look.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Frankly, we did win. Rather than calmly saying, "Let's count the votes. If there's legal issues, we'll go to court and we'll resolve them." Instead, he told his supporters that he actually won the election and the whole thing was a fraud. He said that on November 4th, and he has never recounted that statement since. Despite President Trump's pressure at the time, election officials around the country continued to carry out their duties. And as votes were counted and his loss became more certain, he riled up his base further. Take a look at these tweets. On November 5th, he tweeted in all capital letters, as if shouting commands, quote, "Stop the count. Stop the fraud." Senators, this is dangerous. I also want you to remember these tweets for another reason. Because that's what it looks like when Donald Trump wants people to stop doing something. And bear in mind, this is not the president saying to his supporters that somebody stole your cup of coffee. This is the commander-in-chief telling his supporters, your election is being stolen and you must stop the counting of American votes. And it worked. His words became their actions. His commands led to their actions. Take a look at this. The same day as those tweets, around 100 Trump supporters showed up in front of the Maricopa County Election Center in Phoenix, some of them carrying rifles, literally trying to intimidate officials to stop the count, just as President Trump had commanded. Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs said that protesters were, quote, causing delay and disruption, and preventing those employees from doing their job. Let's call this what it was. We're facing a global pandemic. Workers were risking their health to ensure the integrity of our elections. And President Trump's supporters were encircling them, trying to prevent them from doing their own jobs. This was dangerous, it was scary, and it was a blatant act of political intimidation. In Philadelphia, that same day, police investigated an alleged plot to attack the city's Pennsylvania Convention Center, where votes were being counted. Police took at least one man into custody who was carrying a weapon. And this happened all over, in Atlanta, in Detroit, and in Milwaukee. His supporters used armed force to try to disrupt lawful counting of votes because they bought into Trump's big lie that the election was stolen from them. President Trump's months of inflaming and inciting his supporters had worked. They believed it was their duty to quite literally fight to stop the count, so they showed up at election centers across the country to do just that.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
They ain't taking it from us.
We were winning in all the key locations by a lot, actually. And then our numbers started miraculously getting whittled away in secret.
They will be hiding. They will pay. They will be destroyed because America is rising.
And there it is. They had bought into his big lie. President Trump told his supporters over and over again, nearly every day, in dozens of tweets, speeches, and rallies, that their most precious right in our democracy, their voice, their vote, was being stripped away, and they had to fight to stop that. And they believed him, and so they fought. And you may say, well, he didn't know that they'd take up arms. But when he did know, when it was all over the news, President Trump didn't stop. As Mr. Swalwell will show, after Donald Trump lost, he became even more desperate and incited his base even further. He urged them again and again, with increasingly forceful language, to fight to stop the steal. And even as the certification got closer, and he grew even more desperate, he gave them specific instructions on how, where, and when to fight to stop the steal. He told them to show up on January 6th and march to the U.S. Capitol to stop the certification of the election results. And he told them to come here and fight like hell. You will see clearly that this violent mob that showed up here on January 6th didn't come out of thin air. President Donald John Trump incited this violence. And that's the truth.
Mr. President,
distinguished senators, my name is Eric Swalwell, and I represent California's 15th Congressional District. Manager Castro just told you about Donald Trump's lies and acts before the election. But, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, that wasn't the end of his efforts. That wasn't the beginning of the end. But perhaps it was the end of the beginning. Here's what I mean. You saw President Trump prime for months his supporters to believe that if the election was lost, it only could have been so because it was rigged. But that took time. Just like to build a fire, it doesn't just start with the flames. Donald Trump, for months and months, assembled the tinder, the kindling, threw on logs for fuel to have his supporters believe that the only way their victory would be lost was if it was stolen. So that way, President Trump was ready, if he lost the election, to light the match. And on November 7, after all the votes were counted, President Trump did lose by 7 million votes. But for Donald Trump, all was not lost. He had a backup plan. Instead of accepting the results or pursuing legitimate claims, he told his base more lies. He doused the flames with kerosene. And this wasn't just some random guy at the neighborhood bar blowing off steam. This was our commander-in-chief. Day after day, he told his supporters false, outlandish lies that the victory, that the election outcome was taken and it was rigged. And he had absolutely no support for his claims. But that wasn't the point. He wanted to make his base angrier and angrier. And to make them angry, he was willing to say anything. On November 15, he states, "I concede nothing. We have a long way to go. Rigged election." Doesn't say why the election is rigged. November 17, in a Twitter statement, "Dead people voted." That's it. No evidence, just dead people voted. November 28 Twitter statement, "We have found many illegal votes. Stay tuned." This just wasn't true. He never found illegal votes. He didn't even try to pretend that he had evidence for that. And stay tuned, well, that was all about inciting his base, not about bringing legitimate claims. It was about dramatizing the election to anger his supporters. December 5, you see here, he goes after the governors of Arizona and Georgia, governors from his own party, claiming that they weren't with him. You see, senators, he is casting this in combat terms, that either you are with him, making sure that he won the election, or you're fighting against him. These are just a few of the hundreds of Twitter statements that President Trump sent. And it wasn't just Twitter statements. As you'll see, he was dialing into meetings, holding rallies, appearing on television, continuing to spread the big lie that his election victory was stolen.
People that were dead were signing up for ballots. Not only were they coming in and putting in a ballot, but dead people were requesting ballots. And they were dead for years, and they were requesting ballots.
Dead people voting all over the place?
The alleged Biden margin of victory in several states is entirely accounted for by extraordinarily large midnight vote dumps. You saw them with going up to the sky.
Massive midnight vote dumps. Dead people voting all over the place. He said there were votes going up to the sky. This was never about pursuing legitimate claims. He was saying anything he could to trigger and anger his base so that they would fight like hell to overturn a legitimate election. And it worked. Just as Manager Castro showed you, President Trump's supporters were taking up arms to stop the count. His message to fight like hell was having real consequences. In Michigan, you'll recall that President Trump was attacking that state and its officials. He continued these attacks even after Michigan certified its votes.
Take a look at Michigan. Take a look at what they did with respect to counties. And then you get to Detroit, and it's like more votes than people? Dead people voting all over the place?
You know, I went almost every county in Michigan, almost every district. We should have won that state very easily. We have a similar type of governor, I think, but I'll let you know that in about a week.
He's literally telling them that there were more votes in Detroit than people. About 260,000 people voted in Detroit. There are roughly 500,000 registered voters in Detroit. There are approximately 670,000 people living in the city. So again, not true. But he needed to make these outlandish claims to truly make his supporters believe that their victory was stolen from them. And it was working. A few days after these clips, on December 5, his supporters surrounded the Michigan Secretary of State's home.
Secretary of State's house and the steal. Stop the steal! 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 You're a threat to democracy! You're a threat to free and honest elections!
9 o'clock at night, Secretary's family's inside. Protesters have surrounded her home, and they're chanting that she's a felon. And as we saw, when armed protesters showed up to follow President Trump's direction to stop the steal, this was not the first time that President Trump's supporters used threats and intimidation. President Trump cannot say, "I didn't know what I was inciting." From what Manager Castro showed and what I just showed, there was plenty of evidence that his words had consequences. And if he wanted to stop it, he could stop it. You saw Mr. Castro read statement after statement from our commander-in-chief saying, "Stop the count, stop the steal." President Trump was never shy about using his platforms to try and stop something. He could have very easily told his supporters, "Stop threatening officials. Stop going to their homes. Stop it with the threats." But each time he didn't. Instead, in the face of escalating violence, he incited them further. The next phase in the certification of results was the certification on December 14 of the Electoral College votes. The night before, President Trump personally issued 14 Twitter statements with more false claims about the election being stolen and directing his supporters to make sure that, quote, they cannot be certified. He states here, the rhinos that run the state voting apparatus have caused us the problem of allowing the Democrats to so blatantly cheat in their attempt to steal the election, which we won overwhelmingly. We will never give up. In the face of threats to elected officials, this is his message. And he calls them rhinos, Republicans in name only, and tells them to never give up. President Trump, to him, it was his supporters against anyone who would not overturn the election results so that President Trump could win. But on December 14, despite all of President Trump's efforts to stop, the electors cast their votes according to the will of the American people, and Joe Biden was certified as having won 306 Electoral College votes. The day after this occurred, Leader McConnell recognized this, stating, "Many of us hoped that the presidential election would yield a different result. But our system of government has processes to determine who will be sworn in on January 20. The Electoral College has spoken." As Manager Castro said, no one here, no one among us wants to lose an election. Sometimes there's a reason to dispute an election. Sometimes the count is close. Sometimes we ask for a recount or we go to court. That's entirely appropriate. But what President Trump did was different. What President Trump did was the polar opposite of what any of us would do if we lost an election. Because once the outcome is clear and a judge rules, we concede. We recognize the will of the American people because we let the people decide. And that's what all of the courts, the Justice Department, and the 50 states that had counted the votes, they said it was time for a peaceful transition of power because that's what our Constitution and rule of law demands. Except President Trump. He directed all of the rage that he had incited to January 6th. That was his last chance to stop the peaceful transition of power. And that brings us to the attack. Manager Castro told you the power of the lie, especially when the lie comes from the most powerful person in the world, the commander-in-chief. It also helps if you spend millions of dollars to amplify that lie. You'll see here, in mid-December, President Trump announced the release of ads, including ones entitled, "The evidence is overwhelming," "Fraud," "Stop the steal." He spent $50 million from his legal defense fund on these ads to stop the steal and amplify his message. They were released nationally, played in video ads, online advertising, and targeted text messages. They used the same words and phrases that President Trump had been spreading for months, that the election was full of fraud, to stop the steal. But now they had a specific purpose. How do we know that purpose? These ads were designed to run all the way up to January 5, and then they stopped. This was purposeful and deliberate planning to target his base to rally around that day. And it wasn't just his ads. He continued to use his own platform. He told his supporters, who truly believed their victory had been stolen and who were ready to fight, when, where, and how to stop what he believed was a steal. Donald Trump would issue a deliberate call to action. And just like in his ads, that action centered around January 6th. On December 19, at 1:42 in the morning, our commander-in-chief tweeted, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild. Will be wild." We know why he picked this day. It wasn't random. It was his last chance to stop a peaceful transition of power. And he gave his supporters plenty of time to plan. This was the save the date, sent out 18 days before the event on January 6th. And it wasn't a casual one-off reference or a single invitation. For the next 18 days, Donald Trump would make sure to remind them over and over and over to show up on January 6th. And he would tell them exactly what he wanted them to do. On December 26, he tweets, "If a Democrat presidential candidate had an election rigged and stolen, with proof of such acts at a level never seen before, the Democrat senators would consider it an act of war and fight to the death. Mitch and the Republicans do nothing, just want to let it pass. No fight." He's saying that the Republicans are doing nothing and have no fight because you are doing your job, taking on the constitutional process of certifying the Electoral College results. And he also suggests, President Trump, that if this was the reverse and the Democrats had lost, it would be an act of war. An act of war. That's how Donald Trump prepared his supporters for January 6th. He even stated again 14 minutes later to make sure his supporters understood, quote, "The Justice Department and the FBI have done nothing about the 2020 presidential election voter fraud, the biggest scam, all caps, in our nation's history, despite overwhelming evidence. They should be ashamed." And then he adds, "History will remember. Never give up. See everyone in D.C. on January 6th. That phrase, history will remember, was the first time Donald Trump had used it in his presidency. And he sent this to 70+ million Twitter followers the day they needed to show up and be ready to fight. On December 27, he reminds them again, don't miss it. Information to follow. A few days later, December 30, all caps, see you in D.C. This continues all the way up to January 6. On January 1, he states, the big protest rally in Washington will take place at 11 a.m. Locational details to follow. Stop the steal. You'll see that an hour later, President Trump retweeted one of his Twitter followers. That follower was Kylie Kremer, executive director of Women for America First, the group organizing the January 6th rally and the creator of the Facebook group Stop the Steal. Kremer tweeted, quote, "The cavalry is coming, Mr. President," referring to the cavalry showing up on January 6th. She also added a website for supporters to RSVP and made clear what the message was. Hashtag Stop the Steal. And what did President Trump say in response to hearing that the cavalry was coming? "A great honor," he wrote back. This wasn't just a single tweet. He and his organizers would do this over and over repeatedly. On January 3, another supporter tweets, "We have been marching all around the country for you, Mr. President. Now we will bring it to D.C. on January 6 and proudly stand beside you. Thank you for fighting for us." When President Trump reposted her tweet, she wrote back, "Best day ever. Thank you for the retweet. It has been an honor to stand up and fight for you and our nation. We will be standing strong on January 6th in D.C. with you. We are bringing the cavalry, Mr. President." We are bringing the cavalry. That was the consistent message. This was not just any old protest. President Trump was inciting something historic. The cavalry was coming. And he was organized. In her post, Ms. Lawrence tagged Kylie Kremer, the organizer of the event, whose post we just saw President Trump retweet. Again, you see, this is all connected. I won't show you all of the Twitter statements, and there are a lot, but here's one more. President Trump retweeted another of Ms. Kremer's posts, which had all the details of January 6th with the same hashtags. March for President Trump, do not certify, stop the steal. And in response, President Trump, he writes back, "I will be there. Historic day." Before Congress, I prosecuted violent crimes in California as an Alameda County Deputy District Attorney. And when you investigate and prosecute violent crimes, you have to distinguish. Was this a heat of passion crime, or was it something more deliberate, planned, premeditated? The evidence here on this count is overwhelming. President Trump's conduct leading up to January 6th was deliberate, planned, and premeditated. This was not one speech, not one tweet. It was dozens in rapid succession with the specific details. He was acting as part of the host committee. In fact, when he had assembled his inflamed mob in D.C., he warned us that he knew what was coming. This was President Trump's statement the night before the attack. I should say this was one of his dozens of statements on Twitter in the hours leading up to the attack. I hope the Democrats, and even more importantly, the weak and ineffective rhino section of the Republican Party, are looking at the thousands of people pouring into D.C. They won't stand for a landslide victory to be stolen. At Senate Majority Leader, at John Cornyn, at Senator John Thune. Thousands of people pouring into D.C. who won't stand for the landslide election to be stolen. It's all right there. And he tags senators to pressure you to stop this. And he warns all of us that his thousands of supporters, whom you'll see that the FBI had warned were armed and targeting the Capitol, won't stand for us certifying the results of the election. This was never about one speech. He built this mob over many months with repeated messaging until they believed that they had been robbed of their vote and they would do anything to stop the certification. He made them believe that their victory was stolen and incited them so he could use them to steal the election for himself.
This election was rigged.
This is tyranny against the people of the United States, and we are not standing for it anymore.
If we don't root out the fraud, the tremendous and horrible fraud that's taken place in our 2020 election, we don't have a country anymore.
The left lies, they cheat and they steal. They are ruthless, and they are hell-bent on getting power and control by any means necessary.
Take 3 steps back. Move back.
Can't let it happen. Can't let it happen.
Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
The Democrats are trying to steal the White House. You cannot let them.
Can't let it happen. Never concede. Fight. He told them in speech after speech. These crowds were ready to fight. This is what President Trump was inciting. He foresaw what was coming, and this is what he deliberately led to our doorstep on January 6th. I want to be clear. During this trial, when we talk about the violent mob during the attack, we do not mean every American who showed up at President Trump's rally. Certain Americans came to protest peacefully, as is their right. That is what makes our country so great, to debate freely, openly, and peacefully our differences, just like all of you were attempting to do in this very room on January 6th. But what President Trump did was different. He didn't tell his supporters to fight or be strong in a casual reference. He repeatedly, over months, told them to fight for a specific purpose. He told them their victory was stolen, the election was rigged, and their patriotic duty was to fight to stop the steal. And he repeated this messaging even after he saw the violence it was inciting. And when they were primed and angry and ready to fight, he escalated and channeled their rage with a call to arms. Show up on January 6th at the exact time the votes of the American people were being counted and certified, and then march to the Capitol and fight like hell. He told this to thousands of people who were armed to the teeth, targeting us and determined to stop the Electoral College count. What our commander-in-chief did was wildly different from what anyone here in this room did to raise election concerns. This was a deliberate, premeditated incitement to his base to attack our Capitol while the counting was going on. And it was foreseeable, especially to President Trump, who warned us he knew what was coming. This is what the evidence has overwhelmingly shown and will show in this trial. And it's also the truth.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess for a 15-minute break.
Without objection.
It's a 15-minute break, just so you know, Charles. You know what I am. Charles, I'll duck if I can remember.
So as it turned out, I turn around to my wife and I'm like, what are you doing? I'm at the same time. You're how you are, you're joining now.
This evidence is so powerful, brick by brick. They're showing how Donald Trump built that mob in a very premeditated and deliberate way, not only to stop the count and stop the steal, but to come to Washington and do it violently. The result of Donald Trump deliberately building the mob and then fueling their anger and rage, inviting them to come to Washington, and then to storm the Capitol was, in fact, this violent injury and death that resulted on January 6th. It was planned over days, weeks before the election, warning the only way they would lose is if it were rigged, and then afterward. What should come across the American people is that January 6th was no accident, no isolated act, no aberration. It was deliberately planned, the result of premeditated, inflaming the rage and fury of his followers who believed the big lie.
Where do you think Trump was going? That's one of the hardest things. He knew he had lost the election. He was aware of that. He knew the Congress was going to certify Biden's electoral college victory. What do you think was like his motive? You're a former AG. What was his motive?
He knew he had lost, and the only way he could retain power was by physically stopping the count. In fact, apparently by killing some of the people involved, like Michael Pence.
Overthrowing the government. Want to overthrow the U.S. government.
It was a coup attempt, an effort to overthrow the government and stop democracy from working. The founders' worst nightmare. And that's why this high crime was among the most heinous that any public official could commit. What we will see is that Donald Trump not only incited this riot and insurrection, but also then as commander-in-chief did nothing to save our democracy. In fact, he continued to inflame. He called them special people. And the long-run lesson here is not only about January 6th or about Donald Trump, it is about domestic violence. The danger of domestic violence in this country is persistent and lethal, as the Domestic Terrorism Bulletin has said. It is a real threat to our democracy.
Senator, thank you so much, Senator. Appreciate your time.
Would you expect Democrats to take anything new? You haven't heard of any new evidence of anything? The Democratic impeachment measures.
I am not really aware.
Do you feel like your Republican colleagues are being swayed at all by these arguments?
I haven't talked. I just walked out here.
Thanks.
Can I ask you a policy question? Do you support raising the minimum wage to 15 in the COVID relief bill, and are there concerns about doing that through reconciliation?
I support the $15 minimum wage, and I support doing it in the way that Bernie Sanders has suggested, not during the pandemic, but by 2025 or some year afterward.
Okay. In other words, should it be passed in this bill and done incrementally?
Yes.
Or okay.
Should be in this bill, in my view.
Yeah.
I'm speaking only for myself.
Right.
I think it should be in this bill, and I think it should be done in the way that he agreed on the floor during our budget reconciliation debate. It should be in this bill as a matter of budget reconciliation.
Do you have 50 votes, do you think, to do that?
I think we do.
You do?
I can't be certain as I stand here right now, but I think there are 51 votes.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.
I don't know. I can't see from here, so I don't know.
I never realized I take up a lot of otherwise we have to sit here like this.
That's the guy. right next to Getty. Oh, yeah. Right. So she's sitting there, and she's over here. I'm like, whatever. And she was doing a BP. I'm like, we should be doing the BP and walk over to the fucking officer just down the street. Yeah, you're not supposed to be here. It doesn't matter. Just like, whatever. Like, don't let it. Scott wants up. This is a little twice. This is a little twice. And more detail. That's fluid conversation. She, I don't know, she was, I mean, like, I thought I was listening to an answer. I was just so floored. And afterward, I was like, Spanish is incredible. She comes on me how she learned. I mean, it changed, like, I was like, whoa, 50%. Yeah, 50%. Well, no, it's it was like, as a first question, I was in I mean, sometimes talk about it.
My kids. Mr. Rask.
Thank you, Mr. President. My colleagues Madeline Dean and Ted Lieu will now detail former President Trump's increasingly desperate attempts to stop the steal.
Mr. President, esteemed members of the Senate, it is my solemn honor to be before you today. I am Madeline Dean, Congresswoman from the 4th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. I'm a lawyer. I'm a former professor of writing. I'm a sister. I'm a wife. I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother to 3 with 4th on her way. I'm a person of faith. And I'm an American. Along with Manager Lieu, I will present the actions of a desperate president. And we will present evidence today of a class of public servants who, standing up to enormous pressure from the President of the United States, did the right thing and upheld their oaths. My colleagues just presented evidence of a President Trump's months-long efforts to incite his base, leading them to believe the election was stolen, that they needed to fight like hell to stop the steal on January the 6th. These weren't President Trump's only efforts to overturn the results. Manager Lieu and I will present evidence of President Trump's relentless, escalating campaigns to fabricate an election victory by ignoring adverse court rulings, pressuring and threatening election officials, attacking senators and members of Congress, pressuring the Justice Department, and finally bullying his own vice president. President Trump and his allies filed 62 separate lawsuits in federal courts across more than half a dozen states and the District of Columbia, including Pennsylvania, my home state, as well as Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, and Wisconsin. Of the 62 post-election legal challenges, he lost 61. Only one was successful, and that case involved ballot curing in Pennsylvania and had no impact on President Biden's 80,555 vote victory in our Commonwealth. To be clear, not a single court, not a single judge agreed that the election results were invalid or should be invalidated. Instead, court after court reviewing these challenges said these cases were, quote, not credible, without merit, based on nothing but speculation, and flat out wrong. The judiciary resoundingly rejected Trump's fraud allegations and upheld the election results. But it was more than that. the courts said these cases were different. They were dangerous to our democracy. For an example, in an opinion by United States District Court Judge Matthew Brann from Pennsylvania, he said, and I quote, "This court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations. In the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its sixth most populated state. Our people and laws and institutions demand more. Because this court has no authority to take away the right to vote of even a single person, let alone millions of citizens, it cannot grant plaintiffs' requested relief." That decision by Judge Braun was affirmed on appeal by Judge Stephanos Bibas, a Trump appointee who agreed and wrote, and I quote, "The campaign's claims have no merit. The number of ballots it specifically challenges is far smaller than the roughly 81,000 vote margin of victory. And it never claims fraud or that any of the votes were cast by illegal voters. Plus, tossing out millions of mail-in ballots would be drastic and unprecedented, disenfranchising a huge swath of the electorate and upsetting all down-ballot races," end quote. Similarly, as Judge Linda Parker of the Eastern District of Michigan framed it, she said, "Stunning in its scope and breathtaking in its reach. If granted, the relief would disenfranchise the votes of more than 5.5 million Michigan citizens who, with dignity and hope and a promise of a vote, participated in the 2020 general election. Donald Trump told his supporters they are stealing the election. They took away your vote. It's rigged." That was not true. According to judge after judge, the truth was exactly the opposite. Trump was not suing to ensure election integrity. He was pursuing lawsuits that would, in effect, strip away American votes so that he could win. In other words, Donald Trump was asking the judiciary to take away votes from Americans so that he could steal the election for himself. Then, after losing in all the courts, Trump turned to another tactic, pressuring and threatening election officials. You saw what happened in Michigan after Trump attacked the state and its election officials. His supporters surrounded the Secretary of State's home, as you saw in the earlier slide, chanting, calling her a felon. On November 17th, the Board of Canvassers for Wayne County, Michigan, home to Detroit, unanimously certified the election results for Biden. That same night, after their vote to certify the results, Trump called the two Republican members of that board, pressuring them to change their minds. The call worked. The next day, both Monica Palmer and William Hartman, the Republican board members, attempted to rescind their vote to certify Michigan's election results, but they simply couldn't. President Trump didn't stop there. He then contacted Majority Leader of the Michigan Senate, Mike Shirkey, and the Speaker of the Michigan House, Lee Chatfield, to lobby them to overturn Michigan's results. Trump invited Mr. Chatfield and Mr. Shirkey to Washington to meet with him at the White House, where the president lobbied them further. Let's be clear. Donald Trump was calling officials, hosting them at the White House, urging them to defy the voters in their state and instead award votes to Trump. The officials held strong, and so Trump moved on to a different state, my home state of Pennsylvania. I am certain my senators, Casey and Senator Toomey, remember what happened there. In early December, as he did in Michigan, he began calling election officials, including my former colleagues in the Pennsylvania legislature, Republicans, Majority Leader Kim Ward and Speaker of the House Brian Cutler. Majority Leader Ward said the president called her to, quote, declare there was a fraud in the voting, end quote. Then on November 25th, President Trump phoned into a Republican state Senate policy hearing trying to convince the Republican legislators, senators, and House members there had been a fraud in the vote. He even had his lawyer hold a phone up to the microphone in that hearing room so the committee could hear him. Here is what he said.
We can't let that happen. We can't let it happen for our country. And this election has to be turned around because we won Pennsylvania by a lot, and we won all of these swing states by a lot.
This was a gathering. I've attended many, I have to tell you, as a former state legislator, a lot of policy hearings. I have to say with some confidence that was likely the first time a president of the United States of America called into a state legislative policy hearing. And remember, here is the president saying he won Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania had been certified that Biden had won by more than 80,000 votes. Less than a week after calling into that meeting, he invited multiple Republican members of the Pennsylvania legislature to the White House, the same scheme he had used on the Michigan legislators. It didn't work with those public servants either. Think about it. The President of the United States was calling public officials, calling from the White House, inviting them into the Oval Office, telling them to disenfranchise voters of their state, telling them to overturn the will of the American people. Also, he could take the election for himself. And then in Georgia, a state Trump had counted on for victory, his conduct was perhaps the most egregious. On November 11th, Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger confirmed that he believed ballots were accurately counted for Biden. Trump went on a relentless attack. Here are just a few examples. In all, Trump tweeted at Raffensperger 17 times in the coming week. I'll show you just a few. Calling him a disaster, obstinate, not having a clue, being played for a fool, and being a so-called Republican. All because Raffensperger was doing his job, ensuring the integrity of our elections. And these attacks had consequences. Mr. Raffensperger and his family received death threats. Quote, "Your husband deserves to face a firing squad. You better not botch this recount. Your life depends upon it." The Raffenspergers should be put on trial for treason and face execution. Just some of the threats they received. After these death threats, on November 25th, Mr. Raffensperger wrote an op-ed where he said, "My family voted for Trump, donated to him, and are now being thrown under the bus by him." But he also noted, elections are the bedrock of our democracy. They need to be run fairly and, perhaps more importantly, impartially. That's not partisan. That's just American. It's important to remember that this wasn't just a random attack. Trump wasn't just criticizing a politician over policy. We're saying he didn't agree. Donald Trump was savagely attacking a Secretary of State because the official did his job and certified the state according to how the people in that state voted. Donald Trump was trying to undermine our elections by taking votes away from the American people so that he could remain president. And he was willing to blame and betray anyone, even his own supporters, if they got in the way. Remember, senators, those threats were to Mr. Raffensperger's family. So some may say Trump didn't know his attacks against Mr. Raffensperger would result in death threats, except that all of this was very public. The secretary published his op-ed in USA Today, and major networks, including Fox, covered the threats against the Raffensperger. What did Trump do? Did he stop? Did he say, no, supporters, that isn't what I meant? No, he doubled down. Let's see the evidence.
This was a massive fraud. This should never take place in this country. We're like a third world country. Look at Georgia. But I understand the Secretary of State, who is really he's an enemy of the people. The Secretary of State, and whether he's Republican or not, this man, what he's done.
Like this character in Georgia who's a disaster.
Let that sink in. A Republican public servant doing his job, whose family had just received death threats, and the President of the United States labeled him an enemy of the people. And that's why this is different, because this was not just one attack or one comment. This was attack after attack in the face of clear threats of violence. And on December 1st, another official, Gabriel Sterling, a Republican who voted for Trump, made this point and appealed directly to our president to stop his dangerous conduct.
Mr. President, it looks like you likely lost the state of Georgia. We're investigating. There's always a possibility. I get it. And you have the rights to go through the courts. What you don't have the ability to do, and you need to step up and say this, is stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed.
Mr. Sterling put this perfectly. In this country, we can appropriately challenge a close count, or go to the courts, or disagree with others, or make bold statements. But what Trump was doing was different. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed. Mr. Sterling saw what Trump's conduct was fomenting. He warned him on live TV that violence was already happening and that more violence was foreseeable and inevitable. Sterling's pleas were played over and over on every network. Rather than heed that warning, Trump escalated again. In early December, Trump called Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and pressured him to hold a special session of the state legislature to overturn the election results and to appoint electors who would vote for Trump. A few weeks later, on December 23rd, Trump called the chief investigator for the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, who was conducting an audit of the signature matching procedures for absentee ballots. Trump urged him, find the fraud, and claimed the official would be a national hero if he did. Let's call this what it is. He was asking the official to say there was evidence of fraud when there wasn't any. The official refused, and the investigation was completed. And on December 29th, Raffensperger announced that the audit found, quote, no fraudulent absentee ballots with a 99% confidence level. On January 3rd, Trump tweeted about a call he had with a Georgia election official the day before. He said, and I quote, I spoke to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger yesterday about Fulton County and voter fraud in Georgia. He was unwilling or unable to answer questions such as the ballots under the table scam, ballot destruction, out-of-state voters, dead voters, and more. He has no clue. On January the 5th, the Washington Post released a recording of that call, which had occurred on January 2nd. Remember, just 4 days before the attack on the Capitol. Here is what President Trump said.
It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk.
Let's be clear. This is the President of the United States telling a Secretary of State that if he does not find votes, he will face criminal penalties. And not just any number of votes. Donald Trump was asking the Secretary of State to somehow find the exact number of votes Donald Trump lost the state by. Remember, President Biden won Georgia by 11,779 votes. In his own words, Trump said, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes. He wanted the Secretary of State to somehow find the precise number plus one so that he could win. Here's what he said.
So, look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
He says it right there. The President of the United States telling a public official to manufacture the exact votes needed so he can win. Senators, we must not become numb to this. Trump did this across state after state, so often, so loudly, so publicly. Public officials like you and me receive death threats and calls threatening criminal penalties, all because Trump wanted to remain in power. These public officials exercised great political and personal courage in the face of unprecedented pressure from a President of the United States. Senators, ours is a dialogue with history, a conversation with the past, with a hope for the future. Senators, I thank you today for your kind attention.
Good afternoon. I'm Congressman Ted Lieu. My colleague, Congresswoman Dean, went through President Trump's efforts to overturn the election through the courts, and when that started failing, his deeply disturbing attacks on state and local officials. I'm going to walk through President Trump's extraordinary efforts remaining until January 6th, when he tried again to overturn the election. I first want to highlight Representative Raskin's question to all of you today. Is this America? Like all of you, I love this country. I am an immigrant. My parents came to Ohio, and we started off living in the basement of a person's home. We were poor, and they went to flea markets to sell gifts to make ends meet. Over many years, they built a small business, opened 6 gift stores, and achieved the American dream. It's one reason I joined the United States Air Force on active duty. I believe America is an exceptional country. I was trained as a prosecutor at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, and I remain in the reserves because we're the greatest country in the world. But how did our exceptional country get to the point where a violent mob attacked our Capitol, murdering a police officer, assaulting over 140 other officers? How do we get to the point where rioters desecrated, defiled, and dishonored your Senate chamber, where the very place in which you sit became a crime scene, and where National Guard troops still patrol outside wearing body armor? I'll show you how we got here. President Donald J. Trump ran out of nonviolent options to maintain power. After his efforts in the courts and threatening officials failed, he turned to privately and publicly attacking members of his own party in the House and in the Senate. He would publicly bait senators, naming them in social media. For example, on December 18th, President Trump named at Senate Majority Leader and Republican senators, telling them they have to get tougher or they won't have a Republican Party anymore. We won the presidential election by a lot. Fight for it. Don't let them take it away. President Trump was suggesting to members of this Senate that if they didn't help him try to overturn the election, there would be consequences. On December 24th, President Trump wrote, "I saved at least 8 Republican senators, including Mitch, from losing in the last rigged for-president election. Now they almost all sit back and watch me fight against a crooked and vicious foe, the radical left Democrats. I will," and in all capital letters he wrote, "never forget!" exclamation point. President Trump was telling you that you owe him, that if you don't help him fight to overturn the results, he will never forget, and that there will be consequences. These are threats, just like the threats he made to state and local officials. And it continued. On December 29th, President Trump tweeted, "Can you imagine if the Republicans stole a presidential election from the Democrats? all hell would break out. Republican leadership only wants a path of least resistance. Our leaders, not me, of course, are pathetic. They only know how to lose. P.S. I got many senators and congressmen and congresswomen elected. I do believe they forgot. President Trump targeted senators and members of Congress on social media, calling them pathetic for letting the election get, quote, stolen from them. On January 4th, 2 days before the attack, President Trump tweeted, "The surrender caucus within the Republican Party will go down in infamy as weak and ineffective guardians of our nation, who are willing to accept the certification of fraudulent presidential numbers." Now he's mocking some Republican members as the surrender caucus, calling them weak and ineffective guardians of our nation because they would not pretend that he had won when in fact he had not. And then the very day before the attack, President Trump's threats grew even more heated and specific towards Republicans that he considered to be part of that surrender caucus. Now, we've shown you this tweet before, but I want to draw your attention to how the president was not just inciting his base, but how he was also calling out specific Senate Republicans at the end of this tweet. This is a specific warning to anyone who won't help him overturn the results. Anyone who was against the president became an enemy. And let me be very clear. The president wasn't just coming for one or two people or Democrats like me. He was coming for you, for Democratic and Republican senators. He was coming for all of us, just as the mob did at his direction. In addition to going after senators and members of Congress, President Trump also pressured our Justice Department to investigate the false claims that the election was stolen. At the president's direction, Attorney General William Barr, a loyal member of the president's cabinet, authorized federal prosecutors to pursue substantial allegations of voting and vote tabulation irregularities. Bill Barr pursuing these allegations sparked an outcry. 16 assistant U.S. attorneys in the Trump administration urged the Attorney General to cease investigations because they had not seen evidence of any substantial anomalies. That means they did not find any evidence of real fraud. Attorney General Barr pursued the investigations anyways, and after his investigation, this is what he found, quote, "We have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election." 2 weeks later, on December 14th, the electors voted to give Joe Biden 306 electoral votes and ensured his victory. The following day, Bill Barr resigned. Attorney General Barr had loyally served President Trump. He had never publicly come out against the president, but for Bill Barr, making up election fraud claims and saying the election was stolen was a bridge too far. Bill Barr made clear that attempting to overturn election results crossed a line. According to a news report, Bill Barr, the highest law enforcement official in the land, told President Donald Trump to his face that his theories of election fraud were, quote, bullshit, unquote. When Bill Barr resigned, his former deputy, Jeff Rosen, took his place. President Trump initially tweeted about Mr. Rosen that he was an outstanding person when he announced that he would become acting Attorney General. But when Rosen took over, President Trump put the same pressure on him that he had done with state officials, members of Congress, U.S. senators, and his former Attorney General. President Trump reportedly summoned acting Attorney General Rosen to the Oval Office the next day and pressured Rosen to appoint special counsels to keep investigating the election, including unfounded accusations of widespread voter fraud, and also to investigate Dominion, the voting machines firm. According to reports, Mr. Rosen refused. He maintained that he would make decisions based on the facts and the law, and reminded President Trump what he had already been told by Attorney General Bill Barr, that the department had already investigated and, quote, found no evidence of widespread fraud. But President Trump refused to follow the facts and the law, so the president turned to someone he knew would do his bidding, he turned to Jeffrey Clark, another Justice Department lawyer, who had allegedly expressed support for using the Department of Justice to investigate the election results. Shortly after, Acting Attorney General Rosen followed his duty and the law to refuse to reopen investigations. President Trump intended to replace Mr. Rosen with Mr. Clark, who could then try to stop Congress from certifying the Electoral College results. According to reports, White House counsel Pat Cipollone advised President Trump not to fire Acting Attorney General Rosen. Department officials had also threatened to resign en masse if he had fired Rosen. President Trump's actions, time and time again, made clear that he would do anything and pressure anyone if it meant overturning the election results. We watched President Trump use any means necessary to pursue this aim, feverishly grasping for straws at retaining his hold on the presidency. But all his efforts prior to January 6 kept failing. And finally, in his desperation, he turned on his own vice president. He pressured Mike Pence to violate his constitutional oath and to refuse to certify the oath. President Trump had decided that Vice President Pence, who presided over the certification, could somehow stop it. As Pence will later confirm, the Vice President does not have that power in the Constitution. And President Trump never tried to explain why he thought the Vice President could block the certification of election results. He just began relentlessly attacking the Vice President. Publicly, President Trump attacked Pence on social media and at rallies, getting his supporters to believe that Mike Pence could stop this certification on January 6th. Here's what President Trump said in Georgia on January 4th.
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Behind closed doors, President Trump applied significant pressure to his second in command. Multiple reports confirmed that President Trump used his personal attorneys and other officials to pressure the vice president. Trump reportedly told almost anyone who called him to also call the vice president. According to reports, when Mike Pence was in the Oval Office, President Trump would call people to try to get them to convince the vice president to help him. And President Trump kept repeating the myth that Pence could stop the certification to his base to anger them, hoping to intimidate Mike Pence. On the morning of the rally on January 6th, President Trump tweeted, "All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states," and in all caps he wrote, "and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage." President Trump later went on to attack Pence nearly a dozen times in his speech at the Save America March. Privately, in person, before Pence headed to oversee the joint session on January 6th, President Trump again threatened Pence. "You can either go down in history as a patriot," Mr. Trump told him, according to two people briefed on the conversation, "or you can go down in history as a pussy." As a veteran, I find it deeply dishonorable that our former president and commander-in-chief equated patriotism with violating the Constitution and overturning the election. You will see and hear the consequences of President Trump's repeated attacks on the vice president, the chance of traitor, and the chance of hanging Mike Pence. Thankfully, Vice President Pence stood his ground like our other brave officials stood their ground. He refused the president and fulfilled his duty on January 6th, even after the Capitol was attacked, even after he was personally targeted, even after his family was targeted. Vice President Pence stood strong and certified the election. Vice President Pence showed us what it means to be an American, what it means to show courage. He put his country, his oath, his values, and his morals above the will of one man. The president had tried everything in his power to seize everything in his attempt to seize power from the rightful victor of the election. President Trump's extraordinary actions grew increasingly more desperate. You saw him go from pursuing claims in the courts to threatening state and local election officials, to then attacking members of Congress and the Senate, to compromising our Justice Department, and then to attacking the Republican vice president. These brave public servants were being pressured by our commander-in-chief to overturn the results. Some of them and their families got death threats. Thankfully, at every turn, our democratic processes prevailed and the rule of law prevailed. It is only because all of these people stayed strong and refused President Trump that our republic held fast and the will of the electorate was seen through. And at this point, President Donald J. Trump ran out of nonviolent options to maintain power. I began today by raising the question of how we got here. What you saw was a man so desperate to cling to power that he tried everything he could to keep it. And when he ran out of nonviolent measures, he turned to the violent mob that attacked your Senate chamber on January 6th. As you cast your vote after this trial, I hope each of you will think of the bravery of all these people who said no to President Trump because they knew that this was not right, that this was not America.
Next, Representative Stacey Plaskett of the Virgin Islands will show in quite chilling detail, I should say, how President Trump was well aware of the threat of violence on January 6th and how he welcomed and amplified his supporters' plans for insurrection against the Union. I should say, as lead manager, this is a moment of special pride for me because Representative Plaskett is not only the first delegate ever to be on a team of impeachment managers in American history, but she was also my law student at American University's Washington College of Law. And I hope I'm not violating any federal educational records laws when I say she was an A student then and she's an A+ student now. Stacey Plaskett.
Thank you so much. Height. Mr. President, distinguished senators, I'm Stacey Plaskett, and I represent the people of the Virgin Islands of the United States. Over this past weekend, my 11-year-old daughter, I overheard her telling one of my sons, "Mommy doesn't seem really nervous about the impeachment trial." To which that son, sounding like an older brother, said, "Talia, you'll learn that most of the time, Mommy really seems to have it under control." Now, we know as parents, that's not always the case. But I've learned throughout my life that preparation and truth can carry you far, can allow you to speak truth to power. I've learned that as a young black girl growing up in the projects in Brooklyn, housing community on St. Croix, sent to the most unlikeliest of settings, and now as an adult woman representing an island territory speaking to the U.S. Senate. And because of truth, I am confident today speaking before you, because truth and facts are overwhelming that our president, the President of the United States, incited a mob to storm the Capitol to attempt to stop the certification of a presidential election. My fellow managers have shown and will continue to show clear evidence that President Trump incited a violent mob to storm our Capitol when he ran out of nonviolent means to stop the election. Once assembled, that mob, at the president's direction, erupted into the bloodiest attack on this Capitol since 1814. Some of you have said there's no way the president could have known how violent the mob would be. That is false, because the violence, it was foreseeable. I want to show you why this violence was foreseeable and why Donald Trump was different than any other politician just telling their fighters, their supporters, to fight for something. The violence that occurred on January 6th, like the attack itself, did not just appear. You'll see that Donald Trump knew the people he was inciting. He saw the violence that they were capable of, and he had a pattern and practice of praising and encouraging that violence, never, ever condemning it. And you'll see that this violent attack was not planned in secret. The insurgents believed that they were doing the duty of their president. They were following his orders. And so they publicized it openly, loudly, proudly, exact blueprints of how the attack would be made. Law enforcement saw these postings and reported that these insurgents would violently attack the Capitol itself. This was not just a comment by an official to fight for a cause. This was months of cultivating a base of people who were violent, praising that violence, and then leading that violence, that rage, straight at our door. The point is this: by the time he called the cavalry of his thousands of supporters on January 6th, and an event he had invited them to, he had every reason to know that they were armed, that they were violent, and that they would actually fight. He knew who he was calling and the violence they were capable of. And he still gave that marching orders to go to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell and stop the steal. Make no mistake, the violence was not just foreseeable to President Trump. The violence was what he deliberately encouraged. As early as September, Trump set the precedent that when asked to denounce violence, he would do the opposite and encourage it. Now, if the president had only said something once about fighting to stop the steal and violence erupted, there would be no way to know he intended to incite it or saw it coming. But just as the president spent months spreading his big lie of the election, he also spent months cultivating groups of people who, following his command, repeatedly engaged in real, dangerous violence. And when they did, when the violence erupted as a response to his calls to fight against the stolen election, he did not walk it back. He did not tell them no. He did the opposite. The opposite. He praised and encouraged the violence so that it would continue. He fanned the flame of violence, and it worked. You'll see this over time. These very groups and individuals whose violence the president praised helped lead the attack on January 6th. And that's how we know clearly that President Trump deliberately incited this, and how we know he saw it coming. There are many examples where the president engaged in this pattern, and I'm just going to walk you through a few of them. Let's start with the President Trump's incitement of the Proud Boys. Many of you have heard of this group, which since 2018 has been classified by the FBI as an extremist organization. Since that classification, the group has repeatedly engaged in serious acts of violence, including at pro-Trump rallies. In one such act, on September 7th, the Proud Boys attacked a man with a baseball bat and then punched him while he was down on the ground. On September 29th, during a presidential debate, President Trump was asked specifically if he was willing to condemn white supremacy and militia groups, if he was willing to tell them to stand down and stop the violence. Let's watch.
But are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm willing
prepared
to do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well, go ahead, sir.
Let's hear now the president's response.
Do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
Who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and white
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
When asked to condemn the Proud Boys and white supremacists, what did our president say? He said, stand back and stand by. His message was heard loud and clear. The group adopted that phrase, stand back and stand by, as their official slogan. They created merchandise with their new slogan, which they wore proudly across their backs at Trump's rallies, and they followed the president's orders. You'll see more about this later in the trial, but you'll see in these photos, to the left, Dominic Pizzola, and to the right, William Pepe, two of the leaders of the group, heading to the Capitol on January 6th. They were later charged with working together to obstruct law enforcement. As we go through this evidence, I want you to keep in mind these words by President Trump when asked to condemn violence. Stand back and stand by, and see example after example of the kinds of people like the Proud Boys who he had standing by on January 6th. By October, as my colleagues Mr. Castro and Mr. Swalwell showed you, Donald Trump was escalating his big lie that the only way he could lose the election was if it was rigged. So, as Election Day neared, his supporters were frustrated and they were angry. They were prepared to ensure his victory by any means necessary. One of these violent acts was on October 30th, sometime after 12:30 p.m. A caravan of more than 50 trucks covered in pro-Trump campaign gear confronted and surrounded cars carrying Biden-Harris campaign workers and a Biden-Harris campaign bus as they were traveling down Interstate 35 from San Antonio to Austin. According to witnesses, this caravan repeatedly tried to force the bus you saw and you see in that video to slow down in the middle of the highway and then to run it off the road. What that video you just saw does not show is that the bus that they tried to run off the road was filled with young campaign staff, volunteers, supporters, surrogates, people. As the Trump supporters closed in on the bus, a large black pickup truck adorned with Trump flags suddenly and intentionally swerved and crashed into a car driven by a Biden-Harris volunteer. News of the event went viral on social media. The President of the United States, in a campaign, saw his own supporters trying to run a bus carrying his opponent's campaign workers off the highway, to physically intimidate people in this country campaigning. Here was his response the next day.
2, 1, go! Welcome to the Red Kingdom. Yeah. Red Kingdom. Welcome to the Red Kingdom. Yeah. Red Kingdom. Welcome to the place where we run it.
The President of the United States tweeted a video of his supporters trying to drive a bus off the road. You'll recall in that first video that I showed you, there was no sound. Well, the one that he tweeted had a fight theme song placed to it that the president put that music to that video. And he added at the top, "I love Texas." By the next evening, that tweet that he did had been viewed 12.6 million times. And it wasn't just a tweet. On November 1st, at a Michigan rally with a sea of supporters, the president talked about that incident again. Here it is.
Something. Do you see the way our people, they were protecting his bus yesterday because they're nice. So his bus, they had hundreds of cars. Trump, and the American flag. That's it. You see Trump and American flag.
The president made a public joke of violence against campaigners in an American election. He made light of it. This was not a joke. In fact, it was so violent, it put so many people in harm's way that the FBI investigated the incident and the criminal responsibility of those who attacked these campaign workers. Now, our President Donald Trump could have said, okay, I didn't realize how bad that was. This was very violent. Please stop. But he didn't. He saw the investigation and made a statement in defense of his supporters' attack on the bus, writing, quote, "In my opinion, these patriots did nothing wrong. Engaging in violence for him made them patriots to Donald Trump. For anyone who says Donald Trump didn't know the violence he was inciting, I ask you to consider his supporters tried to drive a bus off the highway in the middle of the day to intimidate his opponent's campaign workers. And his response was to tweet the video of the incident that had fight music, joke about it, and call those individuals in that incident patriots." And once again, Donald Trump's praise worked to incite them further. Emboldened by that praise, they remained ready to fight, ready to stand back and stand by. This link is not hypothetical. Just like we saw with the Proud Boys showing up in full force on January 6th, Donald Trump's encouragement of this attack made sure his supporters were ready for the next one. The caravan bus attack had been organized by a Trump supporter named Keith Lee. Leading up to the attack on our Capitol of January 6th, Mr. Lee teamed up with other supporters to fundraise to help to bring people to Washington, D.C. for that day. The morning of the attack, he filmed footage of the Capitol, pointed out the flimsiness of fencing, and then addressed his supporters before the attack saying, quote, "As soon as you all get done hearing the president, y'all get to the Capitol. We need to surround this place." During the attack, he used a bullhorn to call out for the mob to rush in. He later went to the rotunda himself and then back outside to urge the crowd to come inside. These are the people that President Trump cultivated, who were standing by. I'd like to look at another example. After the election on December 12th, Trump supporters gathered en masse to protest the stolen election in D.C. It was billed by his loyalists as the second Million MAGA March. The rally was organized by Women for America First. The same group that you'll see later secured the permit for the January 6th rally. And who else was there? The Proud Boys, standing by. Donald Trump did not attend that rally, but he made sure to make clear his supporters throughout the day how he felt about the event. At 8:47 a.m., he sent out a tweet. "We have just begun to fight." And then the rally began. And Donald Trump's allies, who spoke at the rally, carried on his message of the stolen election and the importance of fighting to stop the steal. Here's Nicholas Fuentes, a commentator who had organized a Stop the Steal rally in Michigan with Trump supporters.
In the first Million MAGA March, we promised that if the GOP would not do everything in their power to keep Trump in office, then we would destroy the GOP. And as we gather here in Washington, D.C. for a second Million MAGA March, we're done making promises. It has to happen now. We are going to destroy the GOP.
Let's go! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP!
Those words, that was Trump's message. Destroy anyone who won't listen, who won't help them take the election for Trump. And as you will see, this was just the preview for Fuentes, who, like the Proud Boys and the Trump caravan organizers, would later heed the president's call and come to Washington and be there on January 6th. Later in the rally, a former Trump campaign spokeswoman, Katrina Pearson, also spoke. During her speech, she stated, quote, "This isn't over. This is just beginning," referring to the fight to stop the steal. And then she added, "We knew both Republican and Democrats were against we the people. We are the cavalry. No one's coming for us." It's clear that Trump and some of his supporters saw this as war, a fight against anyone who was unwilling to do whatever it took to keep Donald Trump in power. We are the cavalry. And President Trump continued to reinforce his support of these messages throughout the day. At 1:48 p.m., after both speeches, he retweeted his deputy chief of staff's tweet showing his crowd that he had flown over on Marine One, and he tweeted, quote, "Thank you, patriots." These people were, as you can see, gathered en masse and being told by the president's allies that their election had been stolen. And they were told they were the cavalry. No one else could do it. And after hearing these speeches and seeing the president's support, this is what Donald Trump's cavalry was capable of.
What's up? Tonight.
What you just saw was the violence that ensued after that rally. The Proud Boys, after that rally, engaged in serious acts of violence in downtown D.C. Some Trump supporters and self-identified Proud Boys vandalized churches after that rally. If we look at these events, it's clear how we got here. Because what did the president do after that? He turned right around, and a little over a week later, he began coordinating the January 6th Save America rally with the same people who had planned the second Million MAGA March. You'll recall that the Women for America First had organized that second Million MAGA March. They had originally planned rallies for January 22nd and January 23rd, after the inauguration. But Donald Trump had other plans. On December 19th, President Trump tweeted his save the date for January 6th. He told his supporters to come to DC for a big protest, the day billing it as wild. Just days later, Women for America First amended their permit to hold their rally on January 6th, pursuant to the president's save the date, instead of after the inauguration. This was deliberate. Reports confirm that the president himself, President Trump, became directly involved with the planning of the event, including the speaking lineup, even the music to be played, just as he chose the music for his retreat of the caravan driving the Biden-Harris bus off the road with that fight song. And he brought the same people who spoke at the 2 Million MAGA rally to help as well. Trump's campaign advisor, Katrina Pearson, who you recall said on December 12th that this is only the beginning, we are the cavalry, also became directly involved in planning the event. They even sent out invitations together. This is Amy Kremer, one of the founders of Women for America First, tweeting the invitation, tagging Donald Trump and other organizers, inviting the same supporters who had just engaged in serious violence at the 2 Million MAGA rally to show up to the largest rally to stop the steal. And President Trump seemed to have other plans for what was going to happen at that rally, too. Women for America First had initially planned for the rally-goers to remain at the ellipse until the counting of the state electoral slates was completed, just like they had remained at Freedom Plaza after the 2 Million MAGA march. In fact, the permit stated in no uncertain terms that the march from the ellipse was not permitted. It was not until after President Trump and his team became involved in the planning that the march from the ellipse to the Capitol came about, in direct contravention of the original permit. This was not a coincidence. None of this was. Donald Trump, over many months, cultivated violence, praised it, and then when he saw the violence his supporters were capable of, he channeled it to his big, wild, historic event. He organized January 6th with the same people that had just organized a rally, resulting in substantial violence, and made absolutely sure this time these violent rally-goers wouldn't just remain in place. He made sure that those violent people would literally march right here to our steps, from the ellipse to the Capitol, to stop the steal. His cavalry. This was deliberate. And because the President of the United States incited this, because he was orchestrating this, because he was inviting them, the insurgents were not shy about their planning. They believed they were following the orders of the commander-in-chief. They were, as the tweet we just saw, quite literally his cavalry. So they posted exact blueprints of the attack openly, loudly, proudly. And they did this all over public forums. These were not just hidden posts in dark websites that Trump would not have seen, quite the opposite. We know that President Trump's team monitored these websites. We know this because his advisors confirm it. An ex-White House and campaign insider, as you'll read, who has known both Scavino and the president for years, said there was no way that Scavino and the Trump social media operation would not have been aware of the plan circulating online to storm the Capitol. Because, and I quote, The Trump operation closely monitored the web's darkest corners, ranging from mainstream sites such as Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, to fringe message boards like 4chan and XChan, now called XCun, to the Donald.win, an offshoot of a banned Reddit community dedicated to rabidly supporting all things Trump. They actively monitored the exact sites, like the Donald.win, on which these insurrectionists wrote their posts. And so what would Trump and his team have seen when they were monitoring these white sites? What would his supporters have said? They would have seen a clear roadmap of exactly what happened. This is an example of a post that was captured from one of the sites dedicated to Donald Trump that we just talked about, shortly before the site was taken down. And the meme reads, quote, "The Capitol is our goal. Everything else is a distraction. Every corrupt member of Congress locked in one room and surrounded by real Americans is an opportunity that will never present itself again." Let that sink in. Think about that. The exact thing that happened on January 6th, that was their goal. And they said it out loud on sites that the Trump administration was actively monitoring. A third-party site captured a post on the Donald.win where one user posted, quote, "This cannot simply be a protest. It has to be the establishment of the MAGA militia with the command offices set up, with all further militia tactical missions spreading from there." Another user said in response, quote, "We will have to achieve an actual tactical victory, like storming and occupying the Capitol, to have the intended effect." That's what they understood Donald Trump to want. There it is in black and white. And they explained why they felt justified in this. Another poster on the forum, the Donald.win, wrote on January 4th, quote, "If Congress illegally certifies Biden, Trump would have absolutely no choice but to demand us to storm Congress and kill/beat them up. Donald Trump will have no choice." That was what he made them believe, to the point his supporters felt justified even in carrying weapons and storming our Capitol. This was in post after post. Here's another. When discussing how to carry guns into D.C., one noted, quote, "Yes, it's illegal, but this is war, and we are clearly in a post-legal phase of our society." What? They treated it as a war, and they meant it. The morning of the attack, under the thread, "Today I told my kids goodbye," one poster wrote, "Today I had the very difficult conversation with my children that Daddy might not come home from D.C. Within a matter of hours, that post amassed 4,000 likes. President Trump had truly made them believe that their election had been stolen and that it was their patriotic duty to fight to steal it back. Patriotic, a term he gave those who used violence for him, and they were willing to say goodbye to their children for this fight. And their supporters didn't just rely on entering the Capitol with guns haphazardly. They had maps of this building. They talked through which tunnels to use and how to get to the Senate chamber. Some posted specific floor plans, layouts of the Capitol, alongside hopes of overwhelming law enforcement to, quote, "find the tunnels, arrest the worst traitors." Posters also fixated on what they saw as their ability to easily overwhelm the Capitol Police, as, quote, "there are only around 2,000 of them." And again, they urged, quote, "the Capitol is our goal. Everything else is a distraction." There were hundreds of these posts, hundreds, monitored by the Trump administration. And these posts, they were chillingly accurate, right down to communication devices. A new affidavit filed by the FBI described preparations by the right-wing group, the Proud Boys, to storm the Capitol, including using earpieces and walkie-talkies to direct movements throughout the building. This happened. That's the level of planning in advance that occurred. They had earpieces. On the slide, you'll see Proud Boy member Dominic Pizzola has an earpiece in his right ear, consistent with the affidavit. And in addition to these detailed posts, they made clear why they thought they should do this, why they thought they could do this. It wasn't just that they were doing it following the president's orders. They thought he would help them. A third-party site captured a post on the Donald.win again, the site monitored by Trump's team, and he wrote, quote, he, meaning Donald Trump in this instance, can order the Nat Guard to stand down if needed. Unfortunately, he has no control over the Capitol Police, but there are only around 2,000 of them, and a lot are useless fat asses or girls. It's all right there. The overall goal, maps of the Capitol, the weapons, communication devices. They even said publicly, openly, proudly, that President Trump will help them to commandeer the National Guard, so all they have to do is overwhelm the 2,000 Capitol Police officers. This was reported in the NBC News and the Washington Post with headlines like, violent threats ripple through far-right internet forums ahead of protests. Pro-Trump forums erupt with violent threats ahead of Wednesday's rally against the 2020 election. Fox News also reported that the Proud Boys would come to the January 6th rally prepared for violent action, even quoting a Proud Boy member who said they would, quote, incognito and spread across downtown DC in smaller numbers. City officials, seeing these same warnings, also publicly warned about the violence and unlawful weapons at the event. DC Mayor Muriel Bowser cautioned residents of the District of Columbia to avoid the downtown area while the rally attendees were in town. Federal law enforcement warned of these threats also. On January 3rd, a Capitol Police intelligence report warned of a violent scenario in which Congress itself could be the target of the angry supporters of President Trump on January 6th. According to that report, obtained by the Washington Post, supporters of the current president see January 6, 2021, as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election. This sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more incentive to become violent. Unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters as they were previously, but rather Congress itself is the target for January 6th. The day before the rioters stormed the Congress, an FBI office in Virginia also issued an explicit warning that extremists were preparing to travel to Washington to commit violence and, quote, war, according to internal reports. The FBI report cited to an online post where the user declared that Trump supporters should go to Washington and get violent. The supporter said, quote, stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die. These threat warnings were not just hypothetical. Actual arrests occurred in the days leading to the attack. On January 4th, 2 days before the rally, one extremely well-publicized arrest was of a Proud Boy leader who destroyed a church's Black Lives Matter banner a month earlier during the December 12th 2nd Million MAGA March. Report emphasized that when he was arrested, he was carrying high-capacity firearm magazines which he claimed were meant to be supplied to another rally attendee for January 6th. By the night of January 6th attack, D.C. police had already made 6 arrests in connection with the planned protests on charges of carrying weapons, ammunitions, assaulting police. This is all in public view, all of it. The truth is usually seen and rarely heard. Truth is truth, whether denied or not. And the truth is, President Trump had spent months calling his supporters to a march on a specific day, at a specific time, in specific places to stop the certification. And leading up to the event, there were hundreds of posts online showing that his supporters took this as a call to arms to attack the Capitol. There were detailed posts of plans to attack online. Law enforcement warned that these posts were real threats and even made arrests days leading up to the attack. And yet, in the face of all this, these credible warnings of serious, dangerous threats to our Capitol, when those thousands of people were standing in front of President Trump, ready to take orders and attack, this is what he said: "We're going to the Capitol, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." And that's why this is different. And that's why he must be convicted and disqualified.
Representative Dean will now return to the events of January 6th itself. She will demonstrate President Trump's repeated incitement of the crowd that morning as he directed them to the Capitol in his last-ditch effort to retain his hold on power.
For me and for many Americans, January 6th is forever etched in our memories. I went to work with a sense of excitement, the start of my second term in Congress and the first time I would participate in the certification of a presidential election. And then we all know what happened. I know many of us have similar experiences from that day, but I'll briefly share mine. I stood with colleagues in the gallery above the House floor to observe the Arizona challenge. Moments later, police radios reported a breach of the Capitol grounds. Someone shouted up to us, "Duck, then lie down, then ready your gas masks." Shortly after, there was a terrifying banging on the chamber doors. I will never forget that sound. Shouts and panicked calls to my husband and to my sons, instructions to flee, and then the constant whirring of the gas masks filtering the air. The chamber of the United States House of Representatives turned to chaos. For Donald Trump, it was a very different day. Earlier, I showed you Donald Trump's desperate attempts to maintain power, ignoring adverse court rulings, attacking elected officials, pressuring his Justice Department, even attacking his own vice president. You saw a man who refused to lose, who was desperate to retain power by any means necessary. You saw a man willing to attack anyone and everyone who got in his way. And you saw a man who thought he could play by different rules. He told his supporters, as my colleague Ms. Plaskett just showed you, exactly what he thought those different rules were. Combat, fight, violence. This was not just one speech. This was weeks and weeks of deliberate effort by Donald Trump to overturn the election results so that he didn't have to give up the presidency. The speech on January 6th builds on, refers to, and amplifies that same pattern, the pattern Trump had used and broadcasted for months. He refused to lose, his attacks on others, and his different rules. The only thing different about his speech on January 6th from all these other times that we went through was that he was no longer telling his base just that they had to fight to stop the steal. He was finally telling them, now is the time to do it. Here's the place, and here's how. For weeks, he urged his supporters to show up at a specific time and place, and when they got there, he told them exactly what he wanted. Let's start with his desperation. You saw how much planning went into January the 6th, and when the day arrived, Donald Trump's desperation was in full force. Between the time he woke up on January the 5th and the start of the Save America March, that next day, he had tweeted 34 times. When Donald Trump wants to get his message across, he is not shy, as you all know. These tweets were relentless, and these tweets all centered on his singular focus, his drumbeat to motivate, anger, and incite his supporters, his big lie. The presidential election had been rigged, it had been stolen from him, and they had to fight to stop it. And the timing was no coincidence. He sent 34 tweets because this was his last chance to rile up his supporters before the big, historic, wild event he had planned. Now, I won't go through all of these tweets, but let me just highlight a few. At 1 in the morning, he tweeted, "If Vice President Mike Pence comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Mike can send it back." This will look familiar to you because Mr. Liu just showed you how Trump had privately, he was pressuring and publicly attacking his vice president to stop the certification. And when Vice President Pence refused, when he explained that the Constitution simply does not allow him to stop certification, Donald Trump provoked his base to attack him. The late in the evening tweet was no different. It just got more forceful. Let's be clear, what Donald Trump was saying, that Vice President Pence could send back the certification, was not true. For one thing, all 50 states had ratified this election. And for another, Vice President Pence explained to him that he does not have the power to unilaterally overturn states' votes and just send the certification back. And Donald Trump knew this, but this was his last chance to get his vice president to stop the certification, and so he was willing to say or do just about anything. These tweets attacking the election as fraudulent, attacking his vice president, and urging his supporters to fight continued throughout the morning. Here's another example. At 8:17 a.m., he tweeted, "All Mike Pence has to do is send it back to them and back to the states, and we win." And we win. That's what he said, even though by then he had clearly lost. As Trump continued tweeting, the Save America March at the White House was now in full swing. The speakers who warmed up the crowd for Trump were members of his inner circle, family members, his personal attorney, people President Trump had deputized to speak on his behalf. Some of the speakers also spoke at the Second Million MAGA March, which resulted in serious violence. The warm-up acts on January 6th focused on promoting Donald Trump's big lie. They stoked the same fears, a stolen election, of fraud, of ripping victory away from them. And the speakers told them what to do about it. As the crowd erupted in "Fight for Trump," chants throughout that morning, Donald Trump Jr. urged, "That's the message. These guys better fight for Trump." The speakers lasted 3 hours, repeating President Trump's message, and finally, at about noon, Donald Trump took the stage with the seal of the presidency on his podium and the White House as his backdrop. President Trump spoke for more than 70 minutes. His narrative was familiar. It was the same message he had spent months spreading to his supporters. The big lie, the election was stolen, that they should never concede, and that his supporters should be patriots and fight much harder to stop the steal, to take back our country. The same phrases he'd spread for weeks, but now the message was immediate. Now it was just no longer just fight, it was fight right now.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about. And to use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal.
That set the tone. Our country has had enough and we will not take it anymore. He told them and us right at the beginning that the only way to take back the country was to fight. Let's look at what he said next.
And Rudy, you did a great job. He's got guts. You know what? He's got guts, unlike a lot of people in the Republican Party. He's got guts. He fights.
Ms. Plaskett showed you example after example of Donald Trump, when confronted with violence, praising it. We saw him instruct the Proud Boys, a violent extremist group, to stand back and stand by. That group was there on January the 6th. We saw him praise a caravan of his supporters after they tried to drive a bus belonging to the Biden campaign off the road. The organizer of that attack was there on January the 6th. And we saw him team up with the organizers of the violent Second MAGA Million March to plan his rally on January the 6th. And what does he do at that rally? He tells Giuliani he's doing a great job addressing the crowd, saying he has guts to call for fighting. And to be clear, this is what he was praising.
So, let's have trial by combat.
Trial by combat. Donald Trump praised Rudy, said he did a good job, had guts for telling the crowd that we need trial by combat. Next, more attacks.
All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify, and we become president, and you are the happiest people.
This attack, like the tweets he sent that morning, had a purpose: convincing his supporters that the future of our country, of our democracy, hinged on whether Vice President Pence would overturn the election, something he knew Pence could not and would not do. He called out Vice President Pence 9 times that day, and each time he got more forceful. Here's what he said at 12:15.
And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. Because you're sworn to uphold our Constitution. Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong.
We're going to have to fight much harder, and Mike Pence will have to come through for us. That's what he said. And he told the crowd what he meant and exactly what to do, literally commanding them to confront us at the Capitol. He even told them he'd walk there with them, which of course was not true. And then he told them exactly what to do when they got to the Capitol. You'll never take your country back with weakness. You have to show strength. And don't forget who is standing there. The same people Ms. Plaskett described to you. Many people violent. Violent people law enforcement had warned would be armed and would be targeting us. One of President Trump's key defenses focus on what he said for a few seconds, 15 minutes into the speech.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
In a speech spanning almost 11,000 words, yes, we did check, that was the one time, the only time President Trump used the word peaceful or any suggestion of nonviolence. The implication of the president's tweets, the rally, and the speeches were clear. President Trump used the word fight or fighting 20 times, including telling the crowd they needed to fight like hell to save our democracy. We know how the crowd responded to Donald Trump's words, and he knew how they responded to his speech. Here is the evidence of how the crowd reacted.
Here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. Yeah! And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength.
Yes.
Invade the Capitol building.
Let's take the Capitol.
Take the Capitol.
Let's take the Capitol.
Take the Capitol. Take the Capitol right now.
We'll be marching over the Capitol building.
Yes.
To peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
Storm the Capitol. Invade the Capitol. Fight, 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 fight. Take the Capitol right now. These were the words of the crowd. Trump was telling them to fight, and he would keep telling them to fight throughout the rest of his speech. These are not only words of aggression, they are words of insurrection. And if you have any doubt, listen to what he says next.
Today we see a very important event, though, because right over there, right there, we see the event going to take place, and I'm going to be watching because history is going to be made. We're going to see whether or not we have great and courageous leaders or whether or not we have leaders that should be ashamed of themselves. Throughout history, throughout eternity, they'll be ashamed. And you know what? If they do the wrong thing, we should never, ever forget that they did. Never forget. We should never, ever forget.
The commander-in-chief points to Congress and tells those assembled, I'm going to be watching. History is going to be made. This was clearly not just some rally or march or protest. This was about Donald Trump trying to steal the election for himself, claiming that the election was fraudulent, illegitimate, so that his supporters would fight to take it back. In fact, after stoking the crowd's anger for nearly 40 minutes, after repeating false election conspiracy after false election conspiracy, he said this in no uncertain terms.
You will have an illegitimate president. That's what you'll have.
Any outcome besides him keeping the presidency would be illegitimate. This was building on the big lie of a rigged and stolen election. And here's what he said a little later in the speech.
When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do.
When you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules. We told you that context matters. Here's the context. This was not just one reference or a message to supporters by a politician to fight for a cause. He'd assembled thousands of violent people, people he knew were capable of violence, people he had seen be violent. They were standing now in front of him. And then he pointed to us, lit the fuse, and sent an angry mob to fight the perceived enemy, his own vice president and the members of Congress, as we certified an election.
But I said, something's wrong here, something's really wrong, can't have happened, and we fight. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Our exciting adventures and boldest endeavors have not yet begun. My fellow Americans, for our movement, for our children, and for our beloved country, and I say this, despite all that's happened, the best is yet to come. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give, the Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. This is incredible. Thank you very much.
Fight for Trump! 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 What are we here for? Trump! What are we here for? Trump! Fight for 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 Trump!
If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. And there was only one fight left, and it was a mile up the road. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, ordered the crowd to march on Congress, and so the crowd marched. "This is incredible," you heard him say. That's how President Trump ended his speech. I'd like to close with a very brief timeline of what was happening in parallel alongside the President as he spoke on the 6th of January. A little after noon, President Trump began his speech with a fiery refusal to concede. He commanded the crowd to fight and march down Pennsylvania Avenue. And around 12:20, some rally-goers, some attendees began marching. By 12:30, as President Trump continued to incite his supporters, large segments of the rally crowd had amassed at the Capitol. At 12:53, as the president's speech was playing on cell phone broadcasts, the outermost barricade of the northwest side of the Capitol was breached. And Capitol Police were forced back to the steps of the Capitol. At 1:10, the president ended his speech with a final call to fight and a final order to march to the Capitol. At 1:45, the president's followers surged past Capitol Police, shouting, "This is a revolution!" Just after 2:10, an hour after President Trump ended his speech, the insurrectionist mob overwhelmed Capitol security and made it inside the halls of Congress. Because the truth is, this attack never would have happened but for Donald Trump. And so they came, draped in Trump's flag, and used our flag, the American flag, to batter and to bludgeon. And at 2:30, I heard that terrifying banging on House chamber doors. For the first time in more than 200 years, the seat of our government was ransacked on our watch.
Mr. President, I think this would be a good time for a break, if that's okay.
I ask unanimous consent we recess till 4 p.m.
Objection, hearing none, we're recessed.
4 p.m. 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock.
Hi, we're happy to announce that you can also catch us on cable TV now. Millions of households already choose us as one of their trusted news sources, and you can too. You can watch us in Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, and many other cities as well. And if your system doesn't carry NTD yet, you can just give them a quick call and request NTD on your cable provider. Thank you for watching. See you next time.